Milwaukee Public Television is proud to present Next Avenue, Community Conversations. Next Avenue brings baby boomers and beyond smart, useful information and compelling perspectives. Our goal is simple: to provide provocative information that makes your life more meaningful and enjoyable. Next Avenue is made possible by the Helen Daniels Bader Fund, a Bader philanthropy, with a focus on Alzheimer's disease and healthier older adults. On this episode, how to talk to your aging parents, an open and honest conversation about the challenges and family dynamics that can accompany difficult conversations with our loved ones. We are coming to you from beautiful Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Menomonee Falls, Wisconsin. Now here's your host, Mark Siegrist.
You know, it really wasn't that long ago when as much younger, going back a few years now, members of the baby boomer generation, we were the focus of the talk. By that I mean our parents coming to us in our high school years, middle school, encouraging us to move forward with our education, talking to us about the facts of life, whatever, growing pains in general. Well, with the passage of time, now it's incumbent upon us to approach our aging loved ones, our parents, our members of our extended family, to make sure that they're safe, that they're well, that they're in a good place, that they're secure. And that's the focus of our conversation tonight. How do we engage our older loved ones to make sure they're doing well and they are where they should be in life regarding housing, regarding health, and everything that is related to it, finances, whatever. The question remains, how do we prepare for that sensitive discussion or a series of discussions? What kind of homework do we need to do? What kind of issues do we raise? How do we balance sensitivity with making sure that we're covering the ground we have to? How do we divide up the responsibility of that among our siblings? And once we come up with a game plan, how do we monitor the situation to make sure that on an ongoing basis our loved ones are doing well? Well, in order to achieve that tonight, we've recruited an outstanding panel of experts who really, 4 women in the Milwaukee area who have dedicated their lives to the theme we're pursuing tonight. Let me introduce them to you, if I may. We're joined by Miriam Oliensis-Torres. Miriam is a licensed clinical social worker and certified geriatric care manager. She serves as clinical director of Stoll Associates Incorporated, which specializes in geriatric care, management, and caregiving. We are also joined by Beth Meyer-Arnold. She is a registered nurse. She has more than 35 years of experience in long-term care and administration. She is a principal in the consulting and concept development firm known as Signet Innovations Group. Lyn Geboy, Ph.D., is an environmental gerontologist with extensive experience in healthcare and long-term care consulting. She is also a principal in the Signet Innovations Group. And the Reverend Meredith Bedker Musaus. She is the senior pastor and our host this evening here at Holy Cross Lutheran Church. Pastor Meredith and her congregation are deeply involved in the theme of tonight's discussion. How about a round of applause for our special guest this evening? Now, you have dedicated your lives to this subject area that we're talking about tonight. But in conjunction with that, you're also deeply involved on a personal level in a nurturing relationship with loved ones in your extended family, so that we can appreciate the fact that you're not working from textbook cases here, that you're not working off the expertise that you achieved in your degrees. You're also bringing some practicality to our discussion. Mary, maybe you could start us off. What is the current nurturing relationship you're involved in with your older loved ones in your family?
I have 2 aging parents in Milwaukee, and I am the only sibling that's local. I have 2 siblings out of state, so I'm the one on the ground on a daily basis. But even going further back, just as I was starting my career, I had aging grandparents in Florida, and it was the experience with them that led me to the work that I'm doing now.
You're helping care for your father, right?
My parents are caring for each other with some help from outsiders.
Wonderful. And he rides a motorcycle.
My dad does ride a motorcycle.
At the age of?
88.
Okay,
yes.
So there's some concerns here. You're keeping an eye on your dad because you love him, right?
We are, yes.
Absolutely.
We do.
Beth, tell us about your nurturing relationship with your older parents.
Well, currently, along with a huge team of siblings and in-laws and outlaws and grandchildren were supporting my mother. My parents lived together until a year and a half ago. My dad passed away at 91 and a half. My mom is 93, and we're just trying to help her currently really maintain a quality of life, which she questions on a daily basis.
Yes.
Now.
Yes. And
She never thought she'd outlive my dad. It was a big, huge surprise to her, and so we're trying to help her with that.
Yeah.
And
And Lyn, you're in a similar relationship?
Right. On both sides. I'm part of the family network that supports my dad, who is 85 and functionally disabled, mobility impaired from rheumatoid arthritis. My siblings in Madison, my 2 sisters and my brother, do the majority of primary caregiving, and they are doing a tremendous job.
Fantastic.
I support them as best I can. And then my husband and I are the in-town point people for his astounding parents. My father-in-law is 93, and my mother-in-law is almost 90. They still live in their own home that my father-in-law built. I think he doesn't have a motorcycle, but he chops his own wood for their
Seriously, even
today, and that may be one of the keys to longevity.
I guess so.
forget the yogurt and all the other stuff. Chopping your wood and riding a motorcycle.
Chop wood, ride a bike.
That's right.
And Pastor Meredith, you also are in that kind of situation.
My husband and I are the primary caregivers for my soon-to-be 95-year-old father, who is a World War II veteran, 101st Airborne, dynamic, positive gentleman who is really a delight. And it continues to inspire me because he wants to keep learning. And at 95, he's not done learning. So it's really great.
Thank you all for sharing that. Now help us get started. How do we prepare to engage our parents at this stage of their lives in a serious dialogue about where they are, what they need, how we can help them, what kind of homework do we need to do ourselves along with our siblings to just sense what's up? How do we get started, Miriam?
Well, sometimes people ask me, when should we start talking about it? And I tell them that as soon as you start wondering when you should start talking, that's when you should start talking. Okay. As soon
That's
as
the
you
key
have
right
that
there.
question. Absolutely. And the other thing to remember is that the conversation that we're talking about today is just as much listening as talking. So part of what we need to do to open the conversation is to have really, as we're able to, the conversation with the older folks in our lives. How do you think things are going? How are you feeling these days? What do you think about? Do you have any questions? And to start really thinking about not only what's on your mind, but wondering what's on their mind as well.
What are we listening for, Beth? I mean, even before we start asking the questions, maybe over the course of weeks or whatever, and maybe even body language, how they're reacting to us talking on this level with them.
Well, a couple things came to my mind as Miriam was talking, and the first one is that I think we have to keep in mind that aging in itself is not a disease. Our parents might be aging, our grandparents might be aging. That doesn't mean that there's a problem. But on the other hand, we have to start having conversations with them, because there might be things happening that we don't even know is an issue. And until we start having conversations, as Miriam said, what's bothering you? How is life? What are those things that you need to have quality in your life? We might not even know. And especially if we're somebody that doesn't have any medical background, things might be happening that are of a concern, and we don't know until we have those conversations.
But oftentimes, in my relationship with my mother in her later years, she was pretty good at masking stuff. And how do you get the real impression of what's going on? How do you dig a little more deeply, but in the course of the conversation, but also remain respectful and open to what they're saying, Lyn? What is your suggestion for that?
Well, it has to do with it not being a conversation. It has to do with it being a series of conversations. It's a conversation that's going to last for as long as your loved one is alive. That I think is really important, that you start having the talks, and that over the course of those talks, you learn more about what that person is experiencing. They're going to be sharing more over the course of those talks.
Mm-hmm. Pastor, your thoughts on this? You've been through this.
Well, I think it is very important to listen and to ask them the questions in a way that is non-threatening. I think there's always the fear that's behind, why are you asking these questions sometimes? Is my life going to radically change? I don't want to move. But just to try to keep it as non-confrontational, just to have a conversation and to listen in a real clear way, that you're really hearing what people are saying, what your loved one is saying.
Okay, so we're at the point now where we've been observant, we've been listening, we've been looking for cues, we've been looking for things that might enter into this ultimate conversation. Now, Lyn, how do we bring it up? I mean, how do we even approach our parents with this role reversal thing we're going through? How do we even bring up the conversation and help them understand it's out of love and it's not, and we're not trying to be confrontational?
And that's exactly the place to start, to say, I see these things, help me understand. Are you in a comfortable place? Is this a matter that's important to you? I think Miriam, I just saw you. Miriam, what are you thinking on this?
Well, what I'm thinking is, first of all, the part of the anxiety about this kind of conversation is the fear that the older generation may have that the younger generation is going to try to take over and tell them what to do. And the younger generation tends to approach us from the point of view of concern about what if? What am I going to do if this happens to Mom? What am I going to do if that happens to Dad? And is worried about what the future holds. The older generation, on the other hand, approaches us from the point of view of wanting their life to remain as is. So I think the key is to really talk about contingency planning. People do contingency planning all through their lives. They buy homeowners insurance, they buy car insurance, they do wills, all looking at creating a plan for what if. We can approach it the same way in terms of health. We've all lived long enough to know something could change, something could happen at any time. And Mom and Dad, if anything happens to you, I want to know what I need to know so that I can honor your wishes and handle things in the way that you would want them to be handled.
Now, are we talking about a series of conversations here? And how do we not overload? Like, hey, Mom and Dad, it's time for the talk. Here's the to-do list. We got a lot of ground to cover here, so let's turn down the volume on the TV. How do you do that?
Well, the reality is that many times it starts out that way because there's a crisis. There's a crisis. People come together. We have to have this conversation. We're really concerned. And so many times the focus is all about safety. And that can be a trap because there's so much more involved in the person's quality of life. And in order to create this environment where there can be a series of conversations, we have to convey that this is as much about me wanting to talk with you, Mom and Dad, as you sharing with me and with us what's important to you and what you want us to know about how you want to live the rest of your life.
Pastor is shaking your head now. You've seen this scenario unfold a lot.
I was just thinking about, I was very fortunate because my parents have always been very proactive. And so they would discuss it together, share things with us. At one point, they decided that they wanted to move. They were living in Ocala, Florida, wanted to move into a trailer, which had like 5 steps to get into. And so we had the conversation, is that really the best next step for you? Because what if you can't get up the 5 steps? But they were very proactive and brought us into that conversation. And I was fortunate because they looked at it as a new adventure. Albeit difficult, but for us as well as for them, they approached it as how can we make this work? So it was good opportunity for conversations, and a lot of times people wait too long to make those transitions. And then you're in a reactive state rather than a proactive state. And that's what I try to share with some of our folks here that ask questions is, you know, if we can do it before there's the emergency so that you're going, you know, having to make sudden decisions, it's much easier to kind of look down the road if you can have a little bit of lead time.
There are a lot of potential issues that would go on the table. Finances,
Absolutely.
safety, and one of them also would be the environment, which is your expertise, Lyn.
It is.
Making sure that the living space and all related spaces in their lives is appropriate to what they need. Help us understand that, the importance of that.
Yes, environmental gerontology is the theory and research and practice around understanding and optimizing the physical environment for aging. But when we talk about environment, we actually include a more broad perspective. It's not just about the architecture and the interiors, but it's also about the people who live and work there, as well as the neighborhood and the communities. You know, what's the plan? What are the amenities? So we're focused on trying to maximize the supportiveness of the physical environment. And that's the perspective that we have to take when we're looking at people who are still living in their own homes. So the classic examples is we're making sure that throw rugs are out of the place. You know, I want to comment.
Slip and fall, right?
Slip and fall, right. A fall is a terrible beginning to many complications for older adults. So, and we've dealt with this with my mother-in-law who loves her throw rugs. They're part of the expression of her interior designing in her home. We have to respect the fact that she loves those throw rugs, but also make sure that she understands that they're a safety hazard for her now. So we, over the course, here's an example. We thought it was going to be a conversation. I want to say it was 4 or 5 over the course of at least a year, talking about the throw rugs, changing out the throw rugs, buying new throw rugs because, right? I mean, you're laughing because it's about throw rugs, right? But everything is about the throw rugs. So, but it cannot be that we get trapped in this issue of safety first always. So we always have to be balancing what are we doing, how are we helping the person, and how are we making sure that the person is living the life that they want to live.
And these are sensitive issues. Beth, you were sharing with me earlier, even the placement of photographs in a living environment is, and sometimes you can overlook it. Sometimes someone is not, if they're bedridden or restricted movement within the space that they're living in, sometimes they don't have a perspective of pictures that are very important to them.
Yeah, it was a really, you know, it was a revelation to me that when I realized how important it was for my mom, after my dad passed away, he was the one who moved around the house. She didn't move around. It was really, really hard for her to move. But he could sort of bring things to her. Photo albums, this picture, this thing off the wall. He could maybe move her chair a little bit. After he passed away, she spends most of her life in her chair. And she couldn't see the pictures. So going through an old album, I took out a photocopy and put it in a frame and put it on the wall so she could see it. And it was so important to her because there it was right in front of her. And she could see that every day without having to depend on somebody else.
And why is seeing the pictures so important in someone's life at that stage of their life?
Well, I think because right now that's what her life is about.
Okay.
She's proud of, it's her quality of life. And she doesn't want her life to be about conversations about her health, which happens, especially, I mean, my nursing background, any of the nurses in the crowd, we tend to focus those initial conversations with our parents on their health issues. But that's not really what they want to talk about. Might be what we're concerned about, and maybe somehow we have to even that out a little bit, but being careful that that's not always the focus of the conversation.
And I think that's such a great analogy to the whole issue, which is to look at the world through their eyes.
Yeah.
Typically, when we go into a home, the older person has the chair that's theirs that they sit in, and we're sitting opposite, whether it's our parent or the people we work with. And if we just turn around and sit in their chair and see what the world looks like from their point of view, what's their visual scope, and part of what we want to do in the conversation is to see their lives through their eyes to help us get a better understanding of how we can help them.
I know that every family dynamic and every need is different, but what are the most common issues that need to be discussed when we engage our older parents in this kind of conversation? What most frequently needs to be addressed? Is it finances? Is it safety? Is it health? What is it?
Yes.
All of the above.
I mean,
All at one time.
In most cases, there really is a breadth of things that need to be discussed.
I think so. I think it's the biggest one is, when is it time for a change of residence? Also, that's a big, tough issue. If there's a house still involved, and stairs, and yard work, and people are trying to help their parents, or the parents are trying to figure out how can we continue to stay here, but have all those things taken care of. So that many times is the first reason for a conversation.
And when we're speaking with our parents, how many siblings should be involved? I mean, should it be a one-on-one conversation? We don't want to overload the conversation, but should it be all of the siblings together, engaging the parents together?
I think it certainly depends on the family. There are some matters that you don't want to be ganging up on the person.
Right.
So sometimes you have to realize that maybe one person, perhaps the most trusted, or the child who has an expertise in that area, may be the best person to approach the parent. It's really important. More important than how many is the unified front, to the degree that you can have that there's a unified message about how we're going to approach this.
And that unified front shouldn't occur during the conversation, but well in advance of it.
It should, absolutely. In my case, with my father, my siblings do a tremendous job of communicating mostly through email and texting. There is always everyone on all the messages. So there's no piece of information that one person has that other people don't have. And I think that's really important.
The other thing that I think is important to remember when communicating with siblings is everybody has their own point in time at which they notice that things are changing. So being the only daughter in town, I've watched things change for my parents over many years.
Can you give me an example? Help us appreciate that.
For instance, when they lived in a multi-story house, I was the one that was aware of how hard it was to go up and down the stairs. I was the one that started to see changes in eating habits, changing in driving habits, things like that.
Okay.
And so when my siblings would come into town, they would see things for the first time that maybe I had been seeing for a long time. But I had to really respect that they were in a different role. They weren't here on an everyday basis, and they don't have the professional lens through which to see the situation. So through the last number of years, it's been a process of us all getting on board with each other and sharing information and sharing perspectives, and then not ganging up on them, but reinforcing the same messages. I'll talk with them and say, well, you know, when you're here, watch for this, or if you have the chance to talk to them about such and such, would you do that?
Once the issues are on the table and there's initial discussion about it, they've been identified, okay, now how do we start putting together a plan? What's the first step? And to make the person we're trying to help be full party to that conclusion, to that plan.
There's really two parts to that. One is if the older generation agrees that there is a need for something to change, either getting some help or moving. That's one kind of conversation and one kind of plan. If they don't agree, if they say, I'm fine, then another conversation is the hypothetical one. Okay, mom or dad, things are going okay for now, but I need to know from you, if such and such happened, what would you want? And have more of a hypothetical, future-oriented conversation, which makes it less threatening to them.
That's brilliant, because then you're laying it out there, and it's there when it's needed, and you're not being threatening about it.
Right.
You're all shaking your heads. You've been there, right?
One other thing I wanted to add is that I think we might get a plan together and realize that amongst the family, even if you have a professional in the family, you don't have enough expertise. There is an expertise that you might need. Don't be afraid to go out and ask somebody else to help you. Because even if, like in our case right now, there are times when it's really difficult for me to be the daughter and be the nurse. I have to go to my nurse friends and say, I need some help with this. I need a different perspective. Don't be afraid to do that.
And sometimes people step up. In the case with my father, my sister's former co-worker lives in his neighborhood and has volunteered to help take him to doctor's appointments because she's retired and she has the time. That's been wonderful. His neighbor across the street brings his mail up every day. So people on the outside of your family will also see that someone needs help, and they'll step up, and I say embrace them.
And to what degree do they bring a freshness to that conversation and analysis of what the truth is?
No kidding.
I
Absolutely.
mean, there is something to be said for that?
Absolutely, yeah. It's another set of eyes. It's just being there at times when you may not be able to be there.
Your parish is very involved in this stage of it. What do you suggest to your parishioners about reaching out and finding representatives such as the ladies who represent these?
Well, I certainly would reference any of them, you know, as being experts and to work there. But also our county has resources, but it is also difficult to find your way through. And so sometimes you just have to really persevere, ask a lot of questions, ask people who have been through this already. You know, I'll try to connect people. You've just been through this. Who did you land up talking to? And it can be very difficult. And not all families are supportive of one another in this role either. So it can be, you can have family dynamics as well as dealing with aging parents. So sometimes you really do need that outside expert, that county person that comes in and does an evaluation. There's different kinds of tests that they can do, determining whether they're safe in their home, determining where the cognitive level is, things of that nature. So it's persevering, it's asking questions, and I think that sometimes my role is just to listen and to help them find some of those resources so that they can go and explore that.
Oh, I would love to start getting some questions from the audience involved in our ongoing dialogue. And so, John, is it best just to say if someone has a question, just to let you know about it, and we can get a microphone to them. Can I toss in a question we already have from a member of the audience, one that's written out? It says, when it's time to make a decision about your parent, where do you go to find out what are the best facilities? I think this is referring to housing, to new dwellings. Environmental dwellings are your expertise, Lyn. There are a lot of resources out there, but how do you begin in doing your research? How do you begin to discover where those resources are? What's a good starting point?
Well, many counties have catalogs that have all kinds of information about different residential communities. I have to say the great majority, 90%, 95% of people want to stay at home, though. They don't want to move to another environment. And so for me, the push should really be on how can we make their home as safe as it possibly can be. So yes, it involves throw rugs, but it also involves, there's all kinds of information on the internet about home modifications, all kinds of great resources out there. There are people who specialize in modifying homes for aging that I know that Angie's List has some people who are qualified individuals on. So for me, the first focus is how can we make this home environment as safe as it possibly can, and then start to broaden the search. If the decision is made with the parent as well as the children, that a new environment is really the only solution to the situation.
Maureen, you have a question, ma'am? Go right ahead.
I do. I noticed no one talked about the driving issue. You know, and they never want to give up their driving privileges, especially if they're living at home. Mm-hmm. Is there a gentle way to approach that?
Well, driving is one of the big issues. I mean, it's probably a major issue with almost every situation. And that also has to happen in small conversations. It has to do with talking not only about what would happen to the driver, but if the driver would get in an accident, what would happen? How would you feel about that? Where do the people need to drive? I'll never forget when we had first conversation with my dad. My dad was like 88, and he was helping drive cars from the car auction to his nephew's car business. You know, it was like a big, huge guy thing. He would drive in one car with 3 other guys, and they'd go to this car auction, and they'd see cars and talk cars all day long, and then he'd get to drive one home. Well, the other guys were telling my brothers, your dad is kind of going over the middle line. He's driving really slow. So we had to have a whole family conversation about, we have to tell Dad this. Dad would not want these other guys to be thinking that he was a terrible driver. It wasn't, he still didn't want to give up driving, but he did say he would just be a passenger. He could still go. You can still go. You're going to have to ride with somebody. He didn't want to miss the guy thing. But those are the kind of negotiations that have to happen. You know, like most families, we got to the point where Dad would drive to church on Sunday. Drive to church, and then, of course, he would have to stop at the Quick Trip and the Walgreens and the Pick and Save on the way home. But they were all within 1.5 miles, so we kind of let it slide. But, you know, until a couple of their friends got in accidents, it's really tough.
So we should never underestimate the power of having to turn over one's license. I mean, that's how we. I mean, that's who we are, right?
That's who we are as
Well,
Americans, absolutely.
It's very much American and has to do with independence and freedom. But there are resources also. There are occupational therapists who do driving exams. And I know through Froedtert Hospital, they will come and they will take the person in an actual driving so that they can help the driver or the family make adaptations, so make it safer and that might help.
Yeah, and we have another, yes, go ahead.
Sorry. You really have to look at the context, because if there is a need to talk about restricting somebody's ability to drive, you really have to think about what are we going to replace that with.
Exactly.
You can't just take it away.
Right.
And sometimes sons and daughters are reluctant to have that conversation because what they see after mom or dad is no longer driving is then I have to take them everywhere. So really to look at the big picture. And with every loss, there has to be something else introduced to replace that.
Okay, now that's important what you just touched on. How do you do that? I mean, there are certain things that a mom or dad loves to do that's part of their independence. How do we choose that, and how do we put that on the table for them to consider?
A couple of things. One is, as people get older, they're usually willing to give up certain tasks. They may no longer mow the lawn themselves, right, or do the snow themselves, or do the laundry in the basement themselves. But everybody has certain activities which are really part of the core, the essence of who they are. And in our society, traditionally, for men, that's driving, and for women, that's cooking.
Right. Right.
So it's often much easier to get a woman to give up driving than a man, especially if there's a social network around her. But to get a male driver for whom that's a symbol of adulthood to give up driving is a very, very tough sell. For a woman, however, to introduce somebody to come help in the home and cook in their kitchen is much more of a tough sell. If I go to a widowed gentleman who lives alone, the house is kind of a wreck, and I say, would you like somebody to come in and cook and clean and do your laundry?
Hello.
Many times they're very welcoming.
Sure.
But if I say to a woman whose domain is her kitchen, you're not cooking so good anymore. How about if we have somebody come in and cook in your kitchen? For her, that's a real assault.
Yeah.
So we really have to look at the meaning of the activity.
Because
to
it
the
could,
person.
it could theoretically send someone into depression if you were taking away something that's dear to them and represents who they are.
But the other thing we have to look at is the risk to the community.
Right.
And that's where...
And to themselves. And to themselves.
To themselves, but we were talking earlier about informed decision making and people choosing to accept certain risks, whether it's throw rugs or whatever that might be. But when they endanger others, either by driving or the risk of starting a fire in the kitchen when they live in an apartment building, that takes on a different dimension.
And I believe we have another question. Ellis, go ahead, sir. I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
I know we haven't talked about healthcare specifically, but the primary care physicians are great resources also. And when do you think you should involve a discussion with the primary care doctor?
In the matter of driving, or in general?
In general, okay. Whether it's hearing loss or vision loss or safety or any of those issues.
I think if you're at the point where you're gathering information and you don't have good information from the primary care physician, that's absolutely where you need to start, because it helps you fill in some of those blanks that you might not, like you don't have the answer to, or the older adult doesn't have the answer to, because they haven't really been thinking about it that way. So involving the primary care physician, if you can, at the beginning of this data gathering, is always the best place. Because sometimes you're going down a path thinking that you're putting this whole plan together for one issue, and that's not the issue. And hearing and vision deficits are a really good example of that.
And how open can a physician be with the HIPAA laws? And even though you're a member of the family and you're a close relative, how open, how forthcoming can the physician be about where a loved one is in their health situation?
No matter who you are, there needs to be some written documentation of the ability to exchange information, whether that's through a signed release that the patient signs with the healthcare system, or with documents that are created by an attorney that allows you to get access to that information.
So the person themselves can give permission.
Yes.
You're seeing so much of this going on in your daily ministry, Pastor. I mean, so many of these things that we're discussing here are just surfaces all the time.
It does, and I know a lot of our members are going through this very directly right now in their lives, and there are no easy answers, but I think one of the things that I've noticed is that caregivers can feel very isolated, and so it's important to talk to other people, and that they're not complaining, that they're explaining what's going on with their family, not complaining about their parent that they love, but they're explaining how they're really in a quandary. And I think that question brings up that we need a team to work. You know, you need the medical person, you need to have a legal work done, so you need to find a good attorney. Sometimes you need to get a resource person involved, but you can't do it alone. And it really does take a group of people to aid the caregiver in their caring. And it's not easy. And caregiving is exhausting. It can be very exhausting.
Well, putting a team together, it sounds great to have that expertise working with you, but it can also be expensive, can it not?
It can. finding
So-
some. But even with the county, there are some resources available
Okay.
that are not at a cost. That again, persevere. We have a variety of booklets here at church that can help us to seek out those things. So.
Excellent.
Well, and,
Yes.
and there is a cost to seeking the guidance of an expert, whether it's an attorney or a financial planner or a geriatric care manager. But there are also costs to not doing
Yes,
the planning.
absolutely. Yep.
Oh, yeah.
That's a
Oh,
good
yeah.
point.
Absolutely. And we have another question in the audience. Allison, yes.
Okay, I have a question, and actually I got it from a friend who texted me. She said, what do you do when one adult child notices that the parent is starting to slip or have some cognitive issues, and other siblings are saying, no, they're just fine? Well, how do they address that? What are there some resources? Because that does happen. I certainly had it in my own family where I could see something, but my sister could not. And without having a fight about it, how do you address that? Or what resources are available to help everybody kind of address it in a different way?
I think the place to start is the primary care physician there. By having a diagnosis of a cognitive impairment, that should settle the disagreement. You know, there's no doubt that people can be in denial about cognitive impairment with their older adults. And the place to get the information starts with the primary care physician and ruling out other situations like depression or hearing loss. Or
Over-medication.
over-medication, right?
Can I ask something?
Yeah.
Regarding primary care physician, in my mother's case, the primary care physician would give the 20-question survey, and she always passed.
Yes.
And so then the issue of her having an issue, my mother said, no, the doctor said I don't have an issue. The doctor's saying I don't have an issue. My sister's saying I don't. But she absolutely did. And unless you have the resources and know what to do,
Right. Well,
you can have people living where they really are slipping and suffering. And so that's what I'm asking. How do you navigate through that? When you're saying primary care physician, they're not always educated enough to know because they're
That is
just using a
absolutely
simple
true.
tool.
Right.
There's a couple of things. One is that kind of feedback. The sibling from California or New York who says, I talk to Mom on the phone every Sunday and she sounds just fine to me. What are you talking about? To invite them to come and stay with Mom for a week and live in her home and see what it's like on a day-to-day basis. Just like with the driving question, if somebody isn't sure, they want to ask that older person to give up driving, to suggest that that person be a passenger in the older person's car. Okay, and if they're not comfortable being a passenger, what does that tell them about what should be done? So number one, real life experience. And number two, if the primary care physician isn't helpful, there are specialty clinics that can do a geriatric assessment or a cognitive assessment that will give some additional information.
Excellent. We have another question in the audience. And yes.
Yes. I was wondering about the situation where a parent might play off siblings in order to maintain a status quo, if you've encountered that.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Yes, that does happen all the time.
Yes.
And I think that's where siblings have to talk to each other and have to get comfortable. And that doesn't always happen, because we might have been comfortable at some point as siblings talking, and now we're not all at the same comfort level with our parents' situation. Some siblings can accept it, some just can't because right now it reflects their own aging. So those kind of situations are tough and they're real and they happen all the time. And the more conversations you can have and the more family meetings, I'm a huge fan of family meetings. I call them in my family all the time. Now my brothers are starting to call them. And they maybe be called on email or text or phone conversation or in person. But having those family meetings and having some of that discussion get out on the table. And it's not that those conversations don't get resolved in one conversation either, but it's a really
But does there have to be, within a group of siblings, does there have to be a decision maker or not necessarily?
Well, I would say that some people make decisions about some things usually, and other people make decisions about other areas.
And it's proper to divide the responsibility.
Right, and that's one of the things that can come out of a family meeting, is to gather everybody's perspective and then have another part of the conversation be about, okay, what role are you comfortable taking in this situation? For some families for whom there's both local and long-distance siblings, in order to be of help, somebody at a distance might say, okay, I'll help with the bill paying, I'll do mom's bank account online, or I'll call the doctor because even though I'm 500 miles away, it's just as easy for me to make that call, whereas you're in town, okay, you're gonna set up the pills every week. Mm-hmm. This division of responsibilities can be very helpful.
And I would assume that to some degree there's a bonding which occurs in the dividing of the responsibility, and that can be a positive thing as well. So
Absolutely.
Yes, ma'am.
In some families, but I think that for many families too, that if there's any kind of ruffling or for lack of better words, dysfunction that has occurred throughout their family system, it's not going to magically get better when you have aging parents. And so it can be very stressful. And sometimes as a sibling, a person with a sibling, you do just have to say, well, this needs to be done for my parent. I have to step up. And you hope that the others will come to consensus. You hope they'll get on board. You hope they'll be assisting. But sometimes it's you. You got to do it.
In your ministry, have you actually had to referee some meetings?
Did she look like it?
Yeah, I've had to referee a few times.
In your office, you've had to just...
Well, yeah, there's different times because you want to hear different perspectives. But mainly, again, my role is to support and encourage and to listen. And often it's that person who is not getting the cooperation from other people.
Sure.
That I'm listening to, okay. So, but, in my family system, we've been very fortunate that we could work together, but I know that that is not the case in many families. Hey, I'm out, I'm far away, I don't want any part of this decision-making, but by George, when it comes down to the wire, very often that's the person who comes in and says, what, you guys are doing this all wrong, so it can be complicated.
Yeah. And we have another question from the audience. Yes, who has the mic?
We've been talking about siblings, and I have a question regarding the couple that ages together. They're not always aging as gracefully as one another. Mm-hmm. When you have one who becomes the fanciful, independent self who doesn't recognize how much care he's receiving from his caregiving wife, very dutiful, how do you address that without creating a lot of guilt between the two of them? You have the guilt of the caregiver who wants to continue to be able to provide that loving support, and you don't want to create guilt in her husband who now needs to recognize the fact that his wife is also in her 80s or 90s and she can't keep up.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We know for a fact that caregiving takes a toll on people of any age, can take a toll emotionally and physically. And one of the things we try to do in a situation like that is to support the spouse caregiver and to say, we know you're devoted to your spouse and you want to make sure that you are here to take care of him or her. But I know that caregivers have health events that happen. And I know I've personally worked with families in which the spouse caregiver had a stroke or had a sudden unanticipated death. And to really talk with them about, if you want to preserve your ability to be here for your spouse long term, this is more than any one person of any age can do. It's not about you being 85. I'm 55 and I couldn't do this all by myself. You need to have some support, let's talk about what are the things that are most important for you, spouse, to do, and what are some of the things that somebody else could do. I had one lady I worked with who was a devoted caregiver to her husband. Wonderful. One of the things that really bothered her was that she didn't have time to do the ironing. So we got a caregiver in there to do a day of ironing. Next time I went to see her, she was in a freshly pressed white blouse. She was so happy. It made such a difference and lifted that burden. So what's causing the burden and what could be helpful while still respecting their role?
You know, Lyn, it's all about helping someone age gracefully, isn't it? That's what's really what this is all about.
It is. And for the adults who've been married for 60+ years, as in the case of my in-laws, sometimes it's just a matter of starting to talk about the new phase of life, right? That having the conversation around the fact that the relationship may be changing because the needs change over time. But it is, at its heart, it's about understanding and respecting each of those people as individuals. And as Miriam has so eloquently said, finding those things that other people, new members of your team, can do for you that don't impact one's sense of self. That's really where the solution lies.
But I'm sorry.
I think sometimes caregivers are reluctant to accept help because they feel like I should be able to do this myself. And what can be very helpful to them is sometimes I'll say, reflect on it and say, you know, you're actually doing 3 full-time jobs. You're doing everything that you used to do, that you always did, everything that your spouse always did, and taking care of your spouse. Each of those is a full-time job. You can't do 3.
But there's a line, even though we're reaching out and the roles have reversed to some degree, they are still our parents and we are still their children. There's a line. And what should we always be aware of so as not to cross that line?
Well, I think a way to approach things might be to making sure that you are asking them, mom or dad, tell me what's important for you in life now. As Lyn said, things are different. Things are different after living together for 63 years or for being on this earth for 93 years. But if we're approaching them with that question of, tell me what's the most important thing for you, how can we make and saying, you know, sometimes the language that we use or the jargon we use, like quality of life, might not really be the language to use. That's what we're talking about. But saying, Mom, what are those things that you want to have the energy to do? So what do we get help in to help you with so you still have the energy to do those things that you want to do? Right now, my mom would love to play sheep's head once a week. So how do we make sure that she has the energy and that she has her hair done on that day so she looks decent when she goes down to the group to play sheep's head? But those are also conversations that have to continually happen.
You know, we can get so busy in this, you know, being watchful and being caregivers, whatever. How do we allow ourselves and those we're helping to still enjoy the moment?
Right.
How do we do that, though? How do we pull back and say, well, you know what? I could be doing a lot of things with them right now, but I want to enjoy the moment. How do we do that?
Well, one of the ways that I've done is that my dad really does not want me to clean his apartment. And I realize he wants me to spend time with him, not clean his apartment. So when I'm there, he wants me to be more present with him. So it's easy to, you know, so we got somebody to come in and clean the apartment so that my time there can be truly, you know, just visiting. And he always asks, what's new today, you know, and chatting about what's happening or whatever. But I think that's where that quality is, because that meaningful time, because otherwise we can focus on all the other things in the house or whatever. Sometimes you can't bring in a cleaning person, though. So I always try to encourage people, to be gentle on themselves if they are having to do everything. You can't do everything. Some things have to, your quality of conversation may suffer because you do have to do their laundry and have to do their cleaning and all those things. So you have to keep it in balance. You can't do it all.
And you have to ask, as Beth has said, you know, and my dad is different from your dad. My dad likes to have jobs done when people visit. That's what's most important to him. He had my husband, who's a lawyer, fix his lamp 2 weeks ago because that was most important to him. And that's the point, is what's important and then following through and making that person happy that day. That's exactly what we should be doing.
You're all nodding. You've all been there. You've had those moments, and you're still trying to treasure them.
Right.
Absolutely.
You know, I also think we also have to really give ourselves a pat on the back and give ourselves a break, that we're doing the best we can, and that sometimes good enough is good enough. Yeah. And we don't have to be perfect. We don't always have to have every answer, every T crossed and I dotted, and also to not be afraid to ask for help.
Weren't they wonderful? Didn't they do a great job? Thanks to all of you. And continued success in your outreach. We really support you and we appreciate your expertise, and we hope you join us again for our next community conversation. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.